says 6-7% growth every year just to kind of keep people fed and keep things on track.
Yeah, I mean, we often forget, that there are 780 million people in China who depend on the countryside for their livelihoods and their well-being. And income inequality, although it's officially measured that the difference between the top 1% and the bottom 1% is about sort of 8 or 9 to 1 on Chinese measures. Most people think it's more like 20 to 30 to 1. And I think this is a big problem because the good thing about rapid economic acceleration, which is what China has done from per capita income of $1,000 to $4,000, the handmaiden of economic expansion like this is social and political tension.
So if Neil was arguing that the West is on the edge of a big moment, or world history is on the edge, China is too, in the sense that the system can't carry on like this for much longer.
That's my contention, and I think there are two main areas that will become increasingly apparent within the next 5 to 10 years. One is the embedding of Chinese inflation. Which is something which the authorities run scared of, because obviously it was the background to Tiananmen Square, if you remember, in 1989. The other is what the Chinese call the rebalancing of their economy. So they fully recognise that they have to change.
But that will require political... I mean, I remember somebody saying on this programme, actually, a little while ago, that the difference between China and the West, according to the Chinese communist viewpoint, somebody said, well, you in the West, you've got all sorts of different parties. They're like restaurants in a road, all serving the same thing. We only have one restaurant, but we have a large number of different possibilities on the cart.
Well, I think that's the issue. If I could kind of try to rephrase that in a different way, the rebalancing of the economy, in other words, to become a more consumer and service-oriented place. Actually, it's not just a question of ticking off boxes and say, well, we'll have a budget this year and we'll do something next year, and then 3 years' time we'll do something else. This is about taking power, real power, away from people that have it, which is companies, coastal regions and cities, and giving it to people that don't have it, which is the consumer and the countryside and the inland provinces. And I think that rebalancing or the political nature of that is much underappreciated.
I'd like to ask both you and Neil Ferguson the same question, which is that if rule of law, democracy, competition are the really, really important things, why aren't we sitting here saying that India is about to take over the world?
Well, I've just got back from India, funnily enough, and I think India is in many ways sitting pretty, if you buy George's argument, which I largely do. I mean, I would say that China's problem is absolutely that they don't have the rule of law in the sense that I mean it. In civilization. They've downloaded everything else, science, for example, and indeed competition, because it's now a very competitive economy, in some ways more capitalistic than our own. But they do miss the rule of law. As I understand it, that's to say that private property rights are genuinely protected from arbitrary intervention by the state. Go to India, and what you see is that all the killer apps are there, including private property rights and representative government, but they just work very slowly. And I would say India's like one of those PCs, one of those computers that's got all the software, but something's
turn it on, and you have to go in and make
slow.
a cup of tea before you can actually do it.
And I think they need to get some antivirus software in to get rid of the corruption and the red tape, and then India could work really well.
George? I think we agree completely about that. I mean, I think, there are 135 labour laws in India, many of them dating back to independence, which dictate how and in what way companies are allowed to pay wages and hire people and fire people and so on. I mean, this is just one small example of the kind of bureaucracy, and of course, there's obviously widespread corruption, and that's India's kind of lodestone, really, that it's really got to get on top of. Otherwise, it could have an incredibly powerful future. I mean, it has 1/3 of its population are aged under 14, so its working age population will grow in the next 20 years by more than the entire working age population of Western Europe today. Very, very strong background if they can exploit it.
George Magnus at UBS is looking at the emerging economies around the world. Of course, Saudi Arabia, providing all of that oil, is very, very much part of that story, Madame.
Well, exactly, but I think there's still some limitations to China and India playing a greater role. The Saudis, for example, try to build bridges with China and India, and they do have close economic connections. But there is something that is slowing down that kind of relationship, and this is the inferiority complex of the ex-colonies colonies towards their masters. In Saudi Arabia, like many other Western Arab countries, there is still this fascination with the West. When they compare themselves, when they talk about themselves, they talk about themselves vis-à-vis the West, and they're not willing to look east. And this is a deeply ingrained kind of complex. They cannot see that they can learn something from China or India, but they do want to learn it from Britain or the US.
I think that's very interesting. That's a point that you raised, Neil, as well, which is about, even though Western ascendancy may be in decline, the Western model seems to be the commonly accepted model. And I think, when we think about, how is the world, going to evolve post the crisis and so on, the idea of some sort of loose multilateral kind of new world order, to me, is, doesn't kind of ring right. I mean, you have to have leadership, and even if it's benign leadership, and there's two choices. I mean, it's an American leadership or Chinese.
Well, let's move directly to Madawi al-Rashid's Saudi Arabian history, because if we're talking about Western leadership at the moment, there was at least a long pause or a long blink before Washington decided what it really wanted to do about the Arab Spring, and even now we're not sure. But at the heart, sitting at the big question mark, it seems to me, Madawi, at the middle of the Arab Spring, is what happens to Saudi Arabia, because there is the great oil producer, what has been the great regional power in many ways. And we don't hear very much about protests there. We know there have been some on the edges, but every other country pretty much seems to be in turmoil. And I suppose the question is for how long the Al Saud family can continue the game they've been playing.
Well, Saudi Arabia, like any other Arab country, has the same social, economic and political problems. The only difference that Saudi Arabia has is oil. Now, Saudi Arabia, like, again, most of these states that we have seen, the post-colonial states of the Middle East, was founded on the basis of Britain promoting one kind of chieftain against the others. And it's the same sort of British imperial logic, work through the Maharaja in India, but find chieftains in Arabia. And so this model, this British model, continues until the present day. What Saudi Arabia had as an extra is a religious tradition, and that is known in the West as the Wahhabi tradition. The Saudis don't like the name and prefer to call themselves Muslims, but it is a specific Saudi Wahhabi local tradition that existed to domesticate the population, discipline them and punish them. And the British, when they dreamed Saudi Arabia in 1914, they decided that they needed someone to act as a buffer zone between British interests and those sort of backward conservative Wahhabis or religious fanatics. And therefore, the system was put in place during the First World War, and it continues until the present day.
It's a sort of basic, very simple deal. Is that right, between the Al Saud family and the Wahhabis?
Well, it is a deal. It is based on the Al Saud providing political leadership and the Wahhabis, the religious establishment in Saudi Arabia, providing the religious texts, the practices that would discipline the population and prevent it from engaging with the global discourse on democracy, human rights, civil rights, gender equality. So the Al Saud cannot rule without this Wahhabi tradition. And what we hear in the West is that this Al Saud are actually a bunch of progressive princes. Most of them are educated in the Western great tradition in Western universities from the US and Britain. And therefore, they are the progressive agents in society that keep these radical Wahhabis in their place. But the Al Saud are actually part of the problem. And we have seen how they are part of the problem over the last 70, 80 years.
9/11 produced the crisis in this deal, didn't it?
Well, the relationship had always been tense because you have two totalizing systems, the domineering Al Saud and the religious establishment, and they compete over the hearts and minds of the people. In the West, the wisdom was that those princes actually protect us against this uprising of the Wahhabis, the radical. And in the 19th century, early 20th century, they thought they would protect the Indian roots so that they don't go and raid the Gulf ports and disrupt trade to India. But the equation hasn't worked nicely as dreamt by Britain, and we find that there were moments in history whereby this relationship gets upset and sort of stops working. 9/11 is just but one episode when the relationship didn't actually work.
Up to now, the Al Saud clan or family, a very, very large number of people in it, have been able to keep the population happy enough by basically providing very high standards of living or increasing standards of living. That's become more difficult recently.
It's become difficult because of two issues. One of them is the increasing corruption of the Al Saud and the princes, and the second thing is because of the demographic explosion that is being experienced at all levels. And therefore, the more you have of the public purse taken by the Al Saud, the less there is going to be for the population.
As in Yemen, as in Libya, as in
the same
Syria,
story. The same story.
Right.
The only difference is that this economic foundation that is often known as the rentier state economy, whereby you distribute largesse on the population in order to gain loyalty, is not working because people are not accepting that they can only live by bread alone. And this is the slogan that has come in recent years.
Madame, I think it's a fascinating book, and it strikes me that while it's true it may have been dreamt up by the British, it's become a nightmare for the United States. And it's a nightmare because everybody in Washington knows what the reality is of Saudi rule, and they know that the money from their oil comes in to Saudi Arabia, to Riyadh, is redistributed to radical Islamists, not only within Saudi, but much more commonly abroad, to keep the problem abroad. And so, in a sense, Saudi Arabia has become this channel for money to flow to the most radical elements, Wahhabist elements in Islam, and political Islam all over the world is financed this way. But what can the Americans do? Because there's a worse alternative, isn't there, which haunts the United States, namely of the Islamic Republic of Arabia. The Saudi royal family overthrown the 3,000 or 4,000 or 5,000 princes take to their heels, end up in the south of France, and you have an Iranian-style regime, only it's Wahhabist. An Islamic Republic like that would be surely the ultimate nightmare of American foreign policy.
Well, this is absolutely inaccurate, because this is reiterating the discourse that takes place in Washington think tanks about how we have no alternative in Saudi Arabia. First of all, America didn't just inherit the system from Britain, it did encourage it after the Second World War, when America became the patron of Saudi Arabia, and they are the supporters and the guarantors of Saudi security, by which I mean the security of the regime and not the Saudi people. So in a way, the Americans have contributed to creating this problem and making it even better. To just give you an example, in the 1980s, Saudi Wahhabism, the despised preachers of hate, played a great service to Margaret Thatcher and Reagan when they mobilized the population of the Muslim world and shipped them to Afghanistan in the Cold War scheme of things.
In retrospect, possibly a mistake.
It
has to be said.
It was definitely a mistake, but the problem is the short-sightedness of the British and American foreign policy created this monster called Al-Qaeda.
Madani, before we move to other matters, I just want to ask you about the sort of politics of dissent at the moment in Saudi Arabia, because, you know, there are lots of parallels with other parts of the Arab world, and indeed, I'd have thought, with Pakistan. But it's been a protest. It's been there is no sign of a kind of Egyptian-style revolution yet, but the protests that there have been very heavily driven by the internet, by Facebook, and so on. But also that's been manipulated by the regime. I mean, you yourself were on the nasty end of this, weren't you?
Oh yes, I was accused of being behind the Facebook calls, although I don't have my own Facebook, and I have written to Facebook several times to ask them to actually deactivate all the Facebook's pages that are set up in my name. But there is a great difference between Egypt and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, Mubarak was a dictator, but Saudi Arabia is a different kind of dictatorship. Saudi Arabia does not allow civil society organizations. There's no independent human rights organization. There are no trade unions. So Saudis, for them to organize, they have no institutions to go back to the civilization institutional base. And therefore, the only thing left for Saudi is to mobilize on Facebook, but to meet, to actually have bodies meeting on the ground, is the mosque. And this is not because Saudis are religious or particularly conservative. It's because the state has blocked every single outlet, every single civil society organization that allow those people to organize.
So are there things going on there in the mosques in Saudi Arabia that we don't know about in terms of The beginnings of a rebellion.
At the beginning of the call for demonstrations on the 11th of March, the religious establishment, the Wahhabi establishment, which has a double sort of role, it encourages Saudis to mobilize and do jihad abroad, but keep them quiet at
never
home.
at home.
Never at home. And this was so obvious in Afghanistan, it was so obvious in Iraq, and obviously in other places, such as in Bosnia, Chechnya, and other locations.
George Magnus.
Briefly, Madawi, in following the same or pursuing the same theme, I was interested in your book. You talk about how over the years that actually Saudi hegemony in the region, in the Gulf,